William Barclay writes of other rabbis during Jesus' time about what they had to say about and do about leprosy and skin diseases. One rabbi boasted of throwing rocks at lepers to keep them away. Rabbis hid themselves. They ran away at the sight of lepers. A leper was to keep themselves from other humans by a minimum of 6 feet, 15 if the wind was blowing from them towards the person. One rabbi refused to eat an egg bought in a street where a leper had recently passed by. Upon the mountain, Jesus said words like, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They will be comforted. They will be filled. Ask, seek, knock. You will receive and find and be welcomed in." But here in the valley, an unclean man comes into the very presence of Jesus. And it is here in the valley that Jesus offers willing mercy and a gracious response to seeking and asking. Lord, if you're willing. The man comes and he approaches Jesus with humility and respect. Lord, if you're willing, and he believes, you can make me well. What's amazing about this occurrence is that the first thing Jesus does is not speak to him, but he touches him, rendering Jesus immediately unclean. He touches him, and he says, "I am willing." And then he gives a command, "Be clean." Now, this is remarkable to Jews. Not even Moses or Elijah were willing to touch the lepers that came to them. And Moses had to cry out to God in prayer to heal his leprous sister Miriam. Elijah, he had to tell Naaman to go and perform a ritual ceremony in the River Jordan. Jesus, just by a word, "Who is this?" Just by a word, "Be clean." And the man's immediately clean. But it's not enough for Jesus that this man simply be cleaned of his leprosy, because he's known in the community to be unclean and a leper, unwelcome, cannot go into the city, cannot go into the temple. He's not a part of the family of God anymore. And so Jesus tells him, "Go and do exactly what Moses commanded you, to be rendered clean and welcomed back into the family of God." It's not enough just to be clean. Jesus wants to make sure that he's invited back in to be family. Down from the mountain and into the city of Capernaum, this is home base for Jesus. And a centurion comes to him, seeks him out. The centurion was the captain of 100 Roman soldiers. He's Roman. He's a pagan. He's a Gentile. He's the enemy. A Gentile did have access to the temple, but only into the very first court, the court of the Gentiles, no further. Could not get to the Holy of Holies, could not come close to God, and had no access to even the real community of God's people. But you see, this Gentile and enemy, this Roman army officer seeks out Jesus. He does not fall at Jesus' feet as did the leper, as a sign of worship. But he comes and he does call him Lord. It's a word that at the very simplest would mean sir or master. It's a sign of respect, certainly uncommon and unexpected of a Roman officer in addressing a Jew. But at its most respectful, the word Lord, kurios in the Greek, would be a word that a Roman would only use for Caesar. Caesar as a god. Lord, my servant lies at home, paralyzed and in terrible suffering. The Greek word here is pas, not doulos. It could be translated as son rather than servant. And clearly, there is compassion, whether it was a servant, a slave, or it was indeed his son. It seems at least that this servant was more dear, something like a son, than just a slave or a common household servant. And it's also hard to translate Jesus' response. It might be a question, do you want me to go and heal him? But it also may be translated, as it is in the New International Version, simply a statement. Either way, the centurion hasn't actually asked Jesus anything. He simply laid his concern, his heart, at Jesus' feet. But the concern, the desire is evident. And so is the centurion's faith in Jesus' word alone. You don't have to come. I'm a man under authority. In other words, I'm one who can speak a word and it is done. He's just telling Jesus, just say the word. Your word has the authority to do this very thing. And that's what astonishes Jesus, that this Gentile, pagan, outsider has faith in Jesus' word. Jesus has not yet seen that amongst his own people yet. An uncommon faith, Jesus says, uncommon even in Israel, among those who should recognize God's word when they hear it, when they see it, when it happens right in their midst. Now Jesus paints a beautiful picture of truth here, but it comes also with a dire warning. The whole world, Jesus says, will come to the table, the banquet that God is providing. And they will recline at the table. In Israel, just to eat a very common meal, you would sit up. An uncommon, special meal, you would recline. Jesus is speaking here of a very uncommon, special banquet that the whole world will come to. But the warning is this: those who have the grace of God's word in their very midst and yet ignore or refuse it, who should recognize Jesus as sovereign and divine, a word that defines life over, in, and through them. Jesus warns that these people who refuse that will be thrown out of the banquet to a place where, as Jesus says, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's one of those dark images like the Dark Knight movie that's just come out, isn't it? It's used 5 times in Matthew. And every time it is a dire warning to the people of God. I think oftentimes when we think of these warnings that Jesus has, it kind of sound like hellfire and brimstone, this gnashing of teeth, that it's to unbelievers. But Jesus only uses it to those who are the people of God. Dale Bruner writes, he uses it only to those who have been graced with God's gifts, but in vain. This is a warning to church people, to insiders, not outsiders. In the Gospels, Jesus never preaches hell to pagans, to those outside the church. Those words are always a message of warning and yet also invitation to draw those already inside away from beliefs and practices that would keep them from hearing the real word and connecting to the real touch of God through Christ. Outsiders don't hear of the dark and grim reality of life on the outside. They already know that life. What they hear from Jesus is an invitation to enter in. A centurion is given not only the healing word he trusts Jesus can speak, but the offer of heaven as well.